Okay, let's start in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The Lord with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the first letter of John. Beloved, if God has loved us, we must have the same love for one another. No one has ever seen God, yet if we love one another, God dwells in us, and God's love is brought to perfection in us. The way we remain in God and God in us is that God has given us the Spirit. God is love. And whoever lives in love lives in God and God in him. Beloved, let us love one another, because love is of God, and everyone who loves is born of God and has knowledge of God. The one who lives without love knows nothing of God, for God is love. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So welcome back. Also, I just want to mention Susan is here, and Susan's the one who has insisted that I read the book, The Road to Character. I don't know what she meant by it, but so I so far love the book. But if you don't like the book, please send your complaints to Susan. If you do like it. Let's see. So today we have to go over 4 of the apostles, because last week I gobbled with St. Peter too much. So remember I said there's this inner circle of disciples, Peter being kind of the head of the disciples. The other inner circle would be James and John, John the Greater. And they're brothers, and like Peter, they're fishermen. They're brothers who embarrassingly wanted Jesus to destroy the Samaritan village. That's actually a great story. Hope you guys know it, because they'll fill in what John's going to do at the end of his life. They're the brothers that didn't comprehend the transfiguration. They're there for it, Peter, James, and John, but they didn't get it. They were the brothers who asked for the best seats in the kingdom of God. To crack me up. They didn't seem to get what Jesus was talking about in response, that the kingdom of God is about service. Jesus mentions Peter, James, and John fall asleep in the Garden of Eden, Garden of Gethsemane. But we also find that in Acts and later legend, that their fidelity becomes unquestionable. Like Peter, they have kind of a rocky start to their apostleship, but after the resurrection, they actually take on great leadership. And if you notice, it's always Peter, James, and John who are kind of key. They were the witnesses at the raising of the daughter of Jairus. They're also the witnesses of the transfiguration, the agony in the garden. And I like this one too. It was also John who reported to Jesus, asking him to forbid or chew out the guy who was casting out demons in the name of Jesus, but didn't recognize their authority. They missed the point that good is being done, and they just glommed on to the fact that they didn't recognize our authority. So clearly, from just the stories in the Bible, they seem to be a little obsessed about power and authority and control. They'll get over it. So I just want to go over the 2 brothers. First, there's James the elder, also known as James the Greater sometimes. His name would have actually been Jacob. Jacob is the Hebrew for the name James. Jacob means one who supplants, or either trickster. It would have been a very common name. They're the sons of Zebedee. Zebedee in Hebrew means gift from God. Early sources say that Zebedee was a Levite, so he would have had temple connections. They were commercial fishermen. They had a very lucrative family business. And you know that because unlike Peter, who was a fisherman, these guys had employees. So you'd call them commercial fishermen. Let's see. They were probably not educated because it literally says, if you believe the Bible in Acts, the Greek writing says that John and Peter were unlettered, were illiterate. So granted, James and John would have not been from the upper class, but because they were uneducated, but they would have been fairly well off because they had this thriving business. And in 1986, I don't know if you remember this, but they discovered this small fishing boat that dated back to the 1st century in Magdala, the same place where Mary Magdalene was from. And the boat was about 27 feet long, which was a kind of an important discovery because now we know, like James and John, the boat that they would have had, this would have been a typical boat of the time period for commercial fishing. So it would have been 27 feet long. And it needed to be fairly big because these sudden storms would pop up in the Sea of Galilee. Now, what also, and this cracks me up because this is 2,000 years, fishing rights, for you to be a commercial fisherman, you had to purchase the right from the Roman state, which just kind of cracks me up that even 2,000 years ago there's government bureaucracy. But the point being is that they weren't peasants. Jesus really was from the peasant class. But James and John, that's a higher class. And Pilgrim Diaries, clear to the 8th century, mentions that they knew the place of Zebedee's house in Bethsaida. So the brothers were probably from Bethsaida. We don't know where it is now, but it does amaze me that in ancient diaries, they would have known where their original house was. And James the Greater, now there's 2 James, so you have to get used to that. There's James the Greater, which I'm speaking about right now, and James the Lesser. The reason why they called him the Lesser is probably because he was shorter, which I think is clear discrimination. Just throwing that out there. Anyhow, we know nothing of James and John's early life, other than also being called the Greater. He was probably James was the older brother. Let's see, they were probably very ordinary of that Jewish life. Let's see. Also, James is described as one of the first of the apostles of Jesus. And Jesus gives them the name, James and John, the sons of thunder. And that's a joke. I know it doesn't come out, because technically their names would have been, you didn't really have last names. So like, your Bar means son, so it would be John Bar Zebedee, James Bar Zebedee. But Jesus makes this joke of sons of thunder. But we know their mother stuck with him. And Jesus would have intimately known their mother. So what's the joke? Well, it could be one that they're just always like thunder in kind of commotion. But he doesn't call them thunder. He calls them sons of thunder. So just here's what I think it means, because this is my joke. So, I have some nephews, and the 2 older, Matt and Billy, I call sons of thunder. And once I said, "Oh, Billy and Matt, sons of thunder," and my sister yelled from the kitchen, "I know what you're implying!" My sister is a huge yeller. And once I actually told her, I said, "No, I think you're going to affect the boys' self-esteem with all the yelling." And she says, "No." She says, "They don't hear you unless you yell." And it cracks me up. Because she says, my sister said this, she said, the bad thing about raising boys is that you can yell at them, and 10 seconds later, they forgot that you yelled at them. The good thing about raising boys? You can yell at them, and 10 seconds later, they forgot. You do that with a girl? So, anyhow, I actually think the joke is about their mother. And their mother, to me, is, like, I have a warm spot in my heart for Mrs. Zebedee. I don't know her name. Nobody knows her name. They think it was either Mary or Salome, but nobody knows. So I just call her Mrs. Zebedee because I'm formal. What's interesting is that the sons, the brothers, followed Jesus, but not their father, Zebedee. We do know that their mother, Mrs. Zebedee, did follow Jesus. She traveled with them. And yes, there is that embarrassing story where she pushes her sons to ask Jesus that when he comes into his authority, that one sit at his left and one at the right. By the way, what they're trying to do is undercut Peter. They're trying to push Peter out.
She's being a typical Jewish mom.
Very typical Jewish mother. And it results in kind of this jealous reaction from the apostles where they all start to vie for power. But if you remember, Jesus gives this speech about the kingdom of God is about service. Now, embarrassingly, the boys don't get it. The brothers really didn't get that speech, because later they're going to also get upset because somebody doesn't recognize their authority, which sometimes is a problem with bishops and popes. They're more concerned that their authority is recognized rather than good being done. But Mrs. Zebedee got what Jesus was talking about, because she is listed as one of the women that traveled with Jesus and took care of the apostles out of their need. Now, a lot of people, simply because of movies, have this movie image that it was Jesus and the 12 apostles, right? Wrong. It was Jesus, the 12 apostles, other disciples, and a group of women that cared for him. And Mrs. Zebedee is listed as one of the women that cared for Jesus and the apostles. And they used the word deacon, which means servants. And remember, this is kind of shocking. For the first 1,300 years, until the 13th century, we had women deacons. And I know this is radical, I still think we should. So is it implying that Mrs. Zebedee was a deacon in the early church? Because it uses the Greek word deacon, which is a strange word to use. Anyhow, she and Mary, the mother of God, and the other women is also listed as the ones who didn't run away at the crucifixion. Remember, at a crucifixion, if you stick with the person who's getting crucified, you could get punished as well. But Mrs. Zebedee and Mary, the mother of God, didn't run away. I love the idea, too, that Mrs. Zebedee and the Virgin Mary would have been very close. James and John were not faithful at the crucifixion, but their mother was. And the Gospel of John says that the beloved disciple was there at the cross. That could be John, but it doesn't really state that. Another gospel states that when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb with other women, Mrs. Zebedee is listed in that as well. So, yes, she did push her sons towards power, but when Jesus speaks about service, she seems to get it more than the boys. And we don't really know that much about James and John except what's in the Gospels. I've told you the references already. But his death, we do know this too, and this is also kind of a claim to fame for James, is that he was the first apostle to be martyred by Herod. And it says in Acts, when Herod saw that it was pleasing to the Jews in Jerusalem by having James the Greater beheaded, he was encouraged actually to continue his anti-Christian persecution. It was Herod Agrippa, by the way, who executed him by the sword. But his martyrdom is the only one that's actually listed in the New Testament. And so traditionally, he's thought of as the one who's first martyred. Now, according to legend, his remains are held in Santiago de Compostela in Galatia, Spain. So he's the patron saint of Spain. And also, by the way, Chile and Nicaragua, just because of the Spanish influence. So just having traveled a lot in the third world, If you notice in Central American countries, the name Jacob is very popular. It's St. James because it's a patron saint of Spain and also of Nicaragua and Chile. And there's this Spanish tradition of this battle cry before going into battle of Santiago, St. James. And so if you see a statue of him, you're trying to figure out who this person is. He's depicted in pilgrim's clothes with a shell on wearing a shell or having a shell and a pilgrim's hat. Technically a big floppy hat. But the reason why is that because there's the Camino, the walk of Santiago de Castello, you know what that Camino is? Where you make this pilgrimage for St. James. It's the St. James of the Stars pilgrimage. And the shell, I know I mentioned this before, we baptize people using a shell because in the ancient church, if a shell was a symbol of the pilgrim, and the shell, if you know what a shell looks like, it'd be like your spoon to eat with or the bowl that you'd eat with, and you'd wear it around your neck to give a symbol that you're on a pilgrimage, but it also was kind of useful. It was basically your spoon. So the traditional pilgrim to the grave of St. James is known as the Way of James. It's been popular for centuries. His feast day is on the 25th of July, in which supposedly that's when he was martyred. Now, when James, Jesus says to go out to all the world and proselytize. So the legend is James went to Galatia, Spain, to proselytize. And when he was there on the 2nd of January, the Virgin Mary appeared to James on the bank of the Ebro River when he was preaching, and she appeared on a pillar. And that's where she's called Our Lady of the Pillar, Pilar. That's also why you notice the name Pilar sometimes is very, Pilar's pillar, is popular in Spanish circles as well. It's about that veneration. And he returns, after that, he returns back to Judea to be, or Jerusalem, to be beheaded in the year 44 AD. That's the only one we know really that he was, the year that he was actually beheaded. Now, supposedly, after he was beheaded, his body was taken and it was buried in Galatia, Spain. Did it really happen? Who knows? But actually, I have to say, I really do believe it. There's a lot of legends I don't believe. Usually, if there's somehow some sort of commerce or economic ability. Does that make any sense? After that, especially with Italians, I'm very suspicious. But this one seems to be true to a lot of whatever scant historical data we have. So that's St. James. His brother is John, and this sounds kind of embarrassing, but like of the 12 apostles, this is what I kind of think, which one would I want to be like? And what I'm not proud of is that probably I'm most like Paul, because Paul has a bad temper, he gets into fights, and that's not really part of my personality I like, but it seems to be very dominant. If I could be one, I'd want to be most of all John. Second of all, I'd like to be St. Thomas for other reasons, but why I'd like to be John is I have this certain image of the Apostle John, his brother, of friendship and love, and I'll explain that. John in Hebrew means, actually, is it Hebrew or Greek? It doesn't really matter. It means God is gracious, and it would have been a really common name. We know there's John Mark, who the Gospel of John is supposedly, but the name John was so common, you always had to use the middle name. And when we say John, it's always the Apostle John. Now, supposedly, according to legend, John is the only apostle who didn't suffer a martyr's death, that lived to old age. There is a minority story that John died the same time as James, that he was boiled in oil in some place in Italy. But historically, that seems a little out of the groove from Jerusalem to Italy. Does that make any sense? So, and plus, once again, there's an economic benefit that somewhere in the Middle Ages they came up with this, and there's no earlier stories. Does that make sense? So the earliest stories and the most common is that John actually reached old age. Now, his fate is less certain, but there's a lot of rich Catholic legends. So, John is sometimes, this is a question mark. In the Gospel of John, it'll speak about the beloved disciple. So, is John the beloved disciple? Well, nobody knows, but I'll give you my best guess. Yes and no. Thank you. I love that. But one thing I really like about scripture and poetry, like I'm really bad at poetry, but sometimes you'll come across a poem. If it's great poetry, it deals with ambiguity. And to be honest, ambiguity doesn't make the truth more fuzzy. It actually allows more possibilities. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I'm being ambiguous when I say, personally, I believe yes and no. I mean, clearly in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple has a clear role. The beloved disciple is mentioned 8 times. So, as I said, clearly, trying to make a point. And sometimes, and I hate these like Mystery of the Bible shows. Have you ever watched those? Well, stop it. Because they take scant evidence and they over-exaggerate it. And they did this one of, they think Mary Magdalene was the beloved disciple. The problem with that is that it's written in the masculine. So Mary Magdalene would have to be a transvestite. It doesn't match the Greek. In English, you can be non-neutered names, but do you know what I mean? But you can't in Greek. So it is unnamed, but here's the point. And then I'm going to explain, did John write the Gospel of John? That's a yes and no as well. But I love it for this reason. Do I believe that it's John? Yes. But John also, remember, before his deep conversion, it was about recognition and power. They didn't recognize my authority. So when he writes the gospel, I think he does write the beloved, rather than naming himself as this act of humility. The other issue, and this is very common at the time, you're supposed to write yourself into the story. And so who is the beloved disciple? Yeah, it's John, that's a yes. And the no is, it's supposed to be you. Does that make sense? So you're supposed to write yourself in. That's why it's unnamed. Did I lose you on that? So that's typically what scholars would say. So yes, I do believe it. Also, this is the big thing, is the beloved disciple was entrusted at the crucifixion to care for the Virgin Mary. But all the early legends was the Apostle John. There's just so many legends about the Apostle John and Mary. I think it kind of goes together. The third little bit of evidence that John is the beloved disciple is Saint Irenaeus. And Saint Irenaeus, great saint, great theologian, but his mentor and teacher was Saint Polycarp. And Polycarp's mentor and teacher was Saint John. And we have records of all this writing. That's really good street cred to say that your teacher's teacher was Saint John. And Irenaeus tells a story that he said Polycarp told him that John was the beloved disciple. Does that make sense? So for me, that's a slam dunk case. And Irenaeus supports that story that John and Mary, the Virgin Mary, moved to Ephesus, which is part of the story anyhow. So John, back to the Samaritan village, where, remember, James and John are upset because the Samaritans didn't recognize their authority, didn't greet them, didn't offer them hospitality. And so they come to Jesus and they ask Jesus to call down fire from heaven to destroy them. Clearly they have anger issues. And Jesus turns his back on them, the same way he did to Peter, indicating that there being a Satan, They're going against the gospel. So that's pretty significant. The part that I love, and I just love this. So remember, John asked Jesus to destroy the Samaritans with fire, and Jesus clearly upsets Jesus. But in Acts, Peter and John, and clearly John's best friend was St. Peter. They're good friends to each other. It mentions in Acts that Peter and John go to Samaria and convert them by using the fire from heaven, this time the Holy Spirit. Does that make any sense? Like there's this, you read it in the Gospels, but then when you read Acts, you get, they were destroyed by the fire from heaven. Not destroyed in the sense of damnation, but brought by the Spirit of love, rather than the fire of hate. Does that make sense? There's also the great story. I love the story of the Last Supper, where Jesus mentions that somebody is going to hand him over, and Peter, this is a great theology, Peter signals to John, ask him who. And John puts his head on the heart of Jesus and asks. And so, what's the point of that? Is that Peter, who's head of the apostles, is saying this. You can't really ask anything of God by trying to approach God through your own authority, even if you're Pope. I guess God doesn't really care that you're Pope. I'm making a joke. You can't really have a dialogue with the source of love out of your own sense of power. Does that make sense? How you dialogue is like John. You put your head on the heart of Jesus, and there, listening to the heartbeat of Jesus, you can ask a question. And so Saint Evagrius, Evagrius, great theologian from the early church, uses this as a teaching point, saying, whoever rests his head on the heart of Jesus, a theologian you shall be. That if you really want to be a theologian, put your head on the heart of love. It's not about learning Greek or blah, 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 even though Evagrius was a genius. It's about having a head on the heart of Jesus. Does that make sense? Then you can dialogue with the divine. And so John's, you're going to notice in the Gospel of John, love is a big role. In the summertime, I forget what year, we read from the Gospel of John. I think it's year C, but don't quote me, I should know. But honest to God, it's, as a homilist, it gets kind of tiring, because Jesus in the Gospel of John, when he gets on the subject of love, it goes on for chapters. It goes on for weeks at Mass. Jesus can't seem to get off the subject of love. And after a couple weeks about preaching with love, I'm done with it. But in the Gospel of John, love plays a really big deal. So, was John, the Apostle John, the author of the Gospel of John? And church tradition holds that John was the author of the Gospel of John and of the epistles of John, not the book of Revelation. A lot of people get that. The book of Revelation is written by a John, but it says an episcopoi, a bishop. An apostle would not call himself an episcopoi. That's the generation after the apostles. Does that make sense? So in Ecclesiastical History, this book by Eusebius says that the letters of John are written by John, and they mention this consensus that the Gospel of John was written by John, but not the book of Revelation.
Wouldn't it be unusual, though, that his brother was illiterate and he was learned?
Very good point. Wouldn't it be, well, no. It says in the Acts that John is illiterate. So what do you mean? Now, that's a really good point. So the point of this is you have to get in the mindset of first century people. Like the letters of John, they're not letters. They're actually notes. And what they are homiletic notes of somebody else. Does that, like, Susan is writing a letter to her sister. So, but listen, Patty is taking notes. And like, if she published notes, they'd be you can't say the notes of Patty. They would consider that lying, because I'm the one doing the speaking. So even though Patty is the scribe, I'm the one speaking. And like the letters of John, they're homiletic notes. That's why when you read them, they tend to repeat a little, and you don't read it like a letter. I forget what it is, but it's translated in English, so it doesn't make sense. But like they're put, I think, in threes, so they're actually like little homiletic, like this homily, then this homily, and they're just cliff notes, just homilies. Does that make sense? Hard to read as a letter. If you do, you kind of think he's all over the place. It's notes on a homily. Same with the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, yeah, it does say he's unlettered, but even the early church sources say he's the original source. So he told the story, somebody else wrote it, and then somebody else edited it. And that seems, by modern scientific standards, to seem to be a lie. But even in the 14th century, St. Bridget of Sweden, she gets these visions, and God says to St. Bridget, well, write down what I'm going to show you. She says, I won't remember it all. And he says, oh, don't worry. He says, you just do what you can, and then the person that revises those notes, and then the person who revises those notes, I'll work through them, and you'll get it right in the end. So, no, like, I love that story. What's that?
Is that in the Bible?
No, that's St. Bridget. That's 14th century. Long after the Bible. But I actually think that's how God works. Like, well, you can't expect Patty to get everything right, but don't worry. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we know that the Gospel of John went through several stages. Does that make sense? But our early sources say that it was John. Interestingly enough, 19th century scholars, they kind of have found the same thing, that John has gone through several critical adaptations. The Gospel of John was the last written, probably around the year 100, but that actually means it would have been in its final stage in the year 100. But it probably did start with John. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. John and Peter are usually always pictured together. Clearly they're close friends. Why? I don't know. But they're very close. It's Peter and John that go on a mission together to convert the Samaritans. But if you notice, it's only Peter who speaks. Why? Well, you could say one would be that John is shy, and that could be true. But also, the Gospel of John is much different than the other three Gospels. So the other three Gospels really match. They worked off each other. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So those are called the Synoptic Gospels. The Johannine stories, the John, completely different. We have completely different stories in John. And it works much different. John, we have stories that are only in John. The parables are in the Synoptics. John doesn't mention the parables. It is the Gospel of John, great one, but very much different. And the Johannine community really prized St. John, for obvious reasons, which de-emphasized Peter. Does that make sense? And so the theory is that Luke, when he's writing Acts, he knows the Johannine community puts John higher than Peter. Granted, they're obviously close friends, but scholars think they have Peter do all the talking as a way of showing deference to Peter, because the Johannine community put too much deference on John. Just a theory, but I'm throwing it out there. After the rest of Jesus, Peter and John, the beloved, follow him to the palace of the high priest. After Jesus' ascension and descent of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, it's John with Peter who took prominent founding of the church. John is with Peter with the healing of the lame man in the temple, with Peter when he's thrown into prison, with Peter in Samaria. And this is the part that I love. John remained in Judea, in the surrounding area, when the other disciples apostles appeared for the first apostolic council in Jerusalem in 51 AD, when it was declared that the church is open to us Gentiles. And one of the reasons why I like John is I like a saint who doesn't like church meetings. The first one John missed because he was busy in Samaria and didn't want to come. And I thought, I am the same way. Also, St. Paul mentions that John is one of the pillars of the church, quote unquote, pillars of the church. So there's a couple extra traditional biblical traditions that John spent a long duration in Samaria, that John actually remained in the work 12 years, converting. And then when persecution started under Herod Agrippa, and the apostles scattered to evangelize the world, they go to the ends of the world. And John, there is this church community in Ephesus. And John, now it's there before Paul gets there. That's the odd part. But so the original community was under the leadership of somebody named Apollo. We don't know who he is. Some disciple of John the Baptist, who then followed Jesus, who runs away before the resurrection. So he knows the stories of Jesus. But the story is John went to Ephesus with Mary. You know, on the cross, Jesus entrusts the Virgin Mother to John, really the beloved disciple, which means all of us. Does that make sense? But it was really John. And the story is John, when he was aged in Ephesus, trains Polycarp, who later becomes a bishop of Smyrna, who then becomes the teacher of Irenaeus. And as I said, Irenaeus writes in his writings how John and Mary were in Ephesus. He's said to have lived to a very old age. He supposedly lived to 103. Him and Mary lived together. So my only point being is that why I love John is that John, yes, he was at first controlled by ambition and anger, but then really is the patron saint of love. His gospel speaks about the most about love. The reading we started with, the first verse, God is love, and those who know love know God. The one who lives without love, they might know theology, but they know nothing of God. His gospel is actually the most sophisticated when it comes to the Greek. Like Mark, very, very bonehead. No, I'm not putting it down, but it's clearly written by somebody with not much literary skills. The Gospel of John, which it did go through several redactions, highly sophisticated, incredibly sophisticated. Sophisticated Greek, sophisticated themes. I mean, the structure of it is just amazing. It's written in a chiastic structure, so a chiastic structure is a pyramid. Does that make sense? So whatever on this side of the pyramid is also on this side. So there's two healings of a blind, two healings of a deaf. Does that make sense? And then when each of these little steps, there's another chiastic structure. So it's incredibly well edited, sophisticated, but so for that reason, because it has such high theology, his symbol is the eagle. Does that make sense? So if you look in the stained glass windows, and of the tetramorphs that looks like an eagle is the gospel, symbolizes the Gospel of John, because it's the highest theology. But he also speaks about the most about love. So why do I like John the most? Why do I want to be like John? I just love his big theme is love. His close friendship to Peter, his love of Jesus, his love of the Virgin Mary. So he's my favorite. There's some other strange stories about him, just throwing these out, that supposedly he was incredibly good looking. So if you look at like middle-age artwork, like from El Greco, he's stunningly beautiful. Anyhow, supposedly also his body was an incorruptible. If you know what an incorruptible is, I don't know. There's also a middle-aged, do you know what an incorruptible? There's also a middle-aged story, and this one cracks me up. I'm absolutely sure it's not right, but what you'll notice after celibacy comes in, and remember celibacy only came in about 800 years ago, but after that you have these kind of flood of stories of, no offense, of just virginity being the best thing in the world, celibacy being the best thing in the world, and the worst thing in the world is women. Because they're always trying to take our celibacy away. Stop undressing me with your eyes. But then you get really kind of these no, I'm serious. You get kind of a lot of anti-women stories after celibacy is imposed. And so one is John, who, as I said, the legend is that he was best looking. John, the Middle Ages, which is completely if it starts in the Middle Ages, it's probably baloney. If there's no older source backing it up. But I love the story that at the wedding of Cana, that John was the groom, and Mary Magdalene was the bride. And he's so taken with preaching the gospel that he decides to follow Jesus and leaves Mary Magdalene at the altar. And she's so bitter, she turns to a life of prostitution until Jesus straightens her out. Isn't that a great story? I mean, absolutely ridiculous, but I just kind of love it. Sorry, I just love goofy things. What's that? Oh, I thought somebody said something. His feast day is the 27th. Let's see, patron saint of love and loyalty and friendship and offers. Any questions about James and John?
I would like to know what you think about Mary's influence on John's writing. If they spent that much time together.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I don't know. I mean, I know absolutely nothing. I know less than nothing. But that is a great question. If John always was in charge of Mary, and Mary being the premier example of human holiness, I've got to assume that really she has a part influencing his gospel. What it is, I would not know. What's that?
And the emphasis on love in his gospel.
Could be. I guess I won't know till heaven. But you have to say there is this heavy connection. So, yes, heavy connection. But what exactly it is, I wouldn't know.
Can you turn the air conditioner on?
No, I actually can't. Because we went with this computerized system that we get, and I don't understand. It is on. My will be done. Does somebody else have a question?
You talked about the early church, there were women deacons. Is that a possibility in the future?
I have no idea. As I said, I know less than nothing. But with Pope Francis, anything is possible. My God just basically pressured the American bishop to resign today. So, the one from Kansas City, the one that protected shield pedophiles, and Pope Francis said he's not going to tolerate that stuff. So you just never know with him. I don't know. Okay, now we have 15 minutes, so I have to get 2 more apostles in or we won't make it. So can we do Judas? So I have to say, I actually, can't say I love Judas, but I think he's so interesting. So Judas Iscariot, his name, Judah, would be Jewish man. Ish is the Ish, and Isha is male and female. So in the Genesis story, God made them, Ish and Isha, he made them. Ish is how you'd say a man. So it's a man from Kirioth, is actually what his name means. Jewish man from Kirioth. What is that? That is a southern Judean town. That's a really important thing for this reason. He's the only apostle not from Galilee. He's from southern Judea. Does that make sense? And remember I told you about the Galilee being the place where rebellion started? So that since he was from southern Judea, at the time of Christ, the Romans only had their forces in economic or populated towns. Does that make sense? Where they can control things, not the country. They're a little later. So, of all the apostles, since he's from southern Judea, Judas would have known how threatening the Romans are. I mean, in one sense, they all would have known, because 3 times a year you have to go to Jerusalem, and they have thousands of people hanging on crucifixes as you entering Jerusalem, reminding you, do not mess with the Romans. I mean, it's quite intimidating if you've ever had dead bodies hanging around. But Judas would have lived with that. So, it could mean 2 things. One, he knew the power of the Romans and had a great desire, almost as, if you're oppressed, you have a great desire for revolution. And maybe that's like Judas. I mean, Jesus had another zealot who was a revolutionary as an apostle. But it also kind of implies that he also knew the Roman political system, meaning that he knew how to destroy Jesus as well. Does that make sense? The town that he comes from, Kirioth, in Hebrew has some relation to the root word red, because of the red soil in the town. So if you notice in paintings, Judas is often wearing red or has red hair. It's not saying he really was a redhead, even though I think all redheads are dangerous. It's actually this reference to the color red of his name. And so in Shakespeare, Judas will have red hair. Do you think his parents meant anything by giving the name Judas? And remember, we have another apostle named Judas as well, but we call him Jude, so you don't get mixed up Jude with Judas. Because Judah was also of the Maccabees that starts the revolution. But there's another Judas who killed the high priest, was a murderer. So there's that double meaning. Does that make sense? And I love the double meaning because I think all of us, we're like Judas. You can say I'm like John, but we're all also like Judas. That Judas could have started a revolution of the kingdom of God, or could use this knowledge to really destroy Jesus. Does that make sense? Our personalities, our traits, our virtues can go one of 2 ways: support the kingdom of God, or help destroy it. Does that make any sense? Let's see. Also, you'll notice on those Mystery of the Bible show, they always love to say, well, his name could mean dagger because the Sicarii were assassins. Does that make sense? But the problem is, his name does not mean Sicarii. So it's like, just because we don't know Hebrew, it sounds like, well, that could be sick. No, it's a completely different word in Hebrew, number one. Number two, the Sicarii are not going to appear for another 50 years after the death of Jesus, so they weren't around at the time of the apostles. Does that make sense? So don't watch those mystery shows, unless it's NCIS. What was the motivation of Judas? Was he a betrayer or not? Well, clearly Jesus says Satan entered his heart. So did he do it for money? But always remember, at one point, Judas was a good apostle. Jesus promises 12 thrones in the kingdom of God. So Judas promised that. He's good. It's only later that he slowly turns kind of evil. Where at the Last Supper, where he objects about the anointing of Jesus and says that money could have gone to the poor. And at the Last Supper, he hands him over and calls the person who hands him over a devil. Well, that seems pretty clear, right? But wait a minute, didn't he also call Peter Satan? And didn't he call James and John Satan? So, as I said, all of our virtues and vices can work against us. Does that make sense? But Jesus notes at the Last Supper, all are not clean. And he says he knows who will hand him over. And he picks up a morsel of food and gives it to Judas. Now, this is going to be a very important gesture, which I'm going to mention later, but just remember that. And he says, I know who will hand me over. And I'm telling you this now. Jesus says, I'm telling you this now. So later, you'll remember. So you knew. So you know that I know what was going to happen. Does that make sense? He's not a victim. He chooses it. And the Psalms always speak about the life of Jesus. And one of the Psalms says, even my bosom friend has betrayed him. But God will raise me up. So, it was Judas who, and it says, will betray him for silver coins, which Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But the Psalms that were written hundreds of years before are really these prophecies about Jesus. And if the prophecies are true, we know that. But it also would be true that Judas was Jesus' bosom friend. Judas never really asked for money. The priests offer it. Does that make sense? But once he accepts the money, Satan enters his heart. By the way, a little side note. Anybody read Harry Potter? Just the people on this side?
Yeah.
The reason why Voldemort, the betrayer, gets a silver hand is a deference that... not Voldemort, Wormtail. The reason why Wormtail gets a silver hand from the evil wizard is because he's Judas who turned over Harry's parents. Does that make sense? Silver hand. I thought it was very clever. But, so, was he the betrayer or not? Now, remember I said the Bible is poetry, and poetry has ambiguity? And this, I have to say, I love. So to say betrayer in the Greek, you have to put it in the active tense. But here's the shocking part. Judas is mentioned in the passive tense. So it literally doesn't say betrayer. It literally says the one who handed him over. And there's more vagary there. And I love the vagary, and I'm hopefully going to explain it. Maybe not. Do you get the difference? There's a difference between saying betrayer, which is active. I mean, there's like, if you betray me, there's no question. Does that make sense? And it's different to say handed over. Did he hand him over to the Jews to start this revolution, to get it started? Or did he hand him over to betray him? Well, clearly it's because Jesus says that Satan enters his heart. He's betraying him. But my point being is this. Maybe Judas was just impatient. Like, I have a certain impatience, and that even when I'm trying to do good, because of my impatience, I create a little evil. Does that make sense? I know another woman who I consider a saint, but she's so impatient with the evil of the world. I think she pushes people around too much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How do you know Judas wasn't the same way, that he was just so impatient to get the revolution started? He betrays Jesus and turns evil. Does it, what's that?
I don't know.
Because, oh, come on, I
I
understand
think you're
that.
giving him a break.
Sometimes I get so tired of the injustice of the world.
Yeah. Well, you want to make more injustice?
Sometimes, yes. I'm not saying I'm proud of it, but I find myself, like, notice that with these Muslim terrorists, sometimes I'm just like, I'm enough. Kill them all. I'm like, well, you're a Judas. No, really? You're going to bring about the kingdom of God by more violence? Judas, that's what I mean, where Judas maybe allowed his impatience to turn to evil. Does that make sense?
What about the premise that he's basically the last sacrificial lamb, and that someone had to fulfill on that prophecy? So it had to be someone. He became the someone.
I don't really believe that, but yeah, I believe Jesus was a sacrificial lamb, don't get me wrong. But I don't think you had to betray him.
But someone
I think
did,
just
right?
God, no, I don't think anybody had to. I think God will make right our wrongs, but I don't think Judas had to be Judas.
Did someone have to be a Judas?
No, I
to
don't think so.
fulfill prophecy?
I don't think so, no.
They could have just come and took them.
Because I don't let Judas or myself off the hook, I see.
Just, you provoked a thought as far as after Judas hung himself, and I guess he drops out of sight as far as the Bible is concerned. I'm just one. You just.
Okay, can I hold off on that question?
Sure.
So let me finish over the hand over. The phrase hand over, great poetry, which all of you should know, because like St. Paul, different, and we get this, it's part of the Eucharistic prayer. Paul will say, on the night that Jesus was handed over, what does that mean? Well, in one sense you could say, well, it means the night Judas betrayed him. But Paul has a double meaning. Yes, it's the night Jesus was betrayed, but also the night that God handed over to us the bread of life. Does that make sense? And Paul says, hand over what has been handed over to you. He's speaking about the Eucharist. That, like I have to, there's this rule in Catholicism. For me to give you communion at Mass, I first have to have communion. Then once I have Jesus, I can give you the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Does that make sense? So it's that idea that, well, you receive Christ, now you hand it over to somebody else. So there's this great double, I know it's ambiguous, but it has a great meaning. You have a choice of either handing over what you received, like it says in the Eucharistic prayer, that we give to God the bread of life and the cup of salvation. No, we don't. We take it, right? No, we really do hand it back to God. That I receive communion, and then I give the presence of Christ to you, not Linda. But does that mean you spend your life pouring out good for handing over that what has been handed over to you? So on the night it was handed over, yes, it does mean betray, but it also has this Eucharistic idea of the bread from heaven that was handed on to us, that we hand on to the poor, the weak, each other, our family. Does that make sense in Eucharistic life? So there's this double meaning, and that's why they actually came out and said, before it would be the direct Greek of the night it was handed over, blah, 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 blah. But Pope Benedict wanted to say betrayed in English. See, I don't like that clarity, because then it makes it look like I couldn't be a Judas. Does that make sense? But I could be a Judas. And either you're handing over Christ like Judas for personal gain, or you're handing over the Eucharist by pouring out your love and washing other people's feet. Do you see there's kind of a choice there? Did I lose you on that ambiguity? Think how many people turn religion into their personal profit. Yeah, I think that's really being a Judas. You're handing over Christ. And think also liturgically, how is Jesus betrayed by Judas? But through a kiss, right? Jesus is so common and so ordinary. He didn't stick out of a crowd. The soldiers wouldn't know who to arrest. So Peter says, the one I kiss. Well, in Judas, who did I say? Oh, Peter, sorry. Judas. But think about this. In the early church, you'd give the sign of peace by offering the people around you a kiss. Not a handshake, a kiss. It's called the kiss of peace. I don't want your lips on any part of me. So, us being a more formal society, we just give a handshake. Does that make sense? But it actually is the kiss of peace. And just think with the liturgical symbol of Judas is, it is possible for Judas to make this Eucharistic sign of the kiss of peace, but he's a liar. Does that make sense? But he offers the sign of peace when he's ready to destroy somebody. And you have to kind of put yourself in that. How many times, we'll take Lori because she has anger issues. Does she give the sign of peace to people? But, she's doing the gesture. But in her heart, there is a lot of hatred. Boiling, simmering in that. No joke. But, does that make any sense? I love the phrase handed over. I love the liturgical. He betrays him with a liturgical symbol. He betrays Jesus with an action of liturgy, which how many of us have been unfaithful with that? And yes, his suicide is kind of a repentant, he dies as, I don't know about this, he dies repentantly. You know, he asks the priest, he returns the money to the priest, but it's blood money, so the priest won't take it. And they give it to the potter's field for the poor, which fulfills Zechariah's prophecies of fulfilled. But anyhow, but he commits suicide. Now, Peter and Judas are very similar. They both denied Christ, right? They both sinned. Peter seeks forgiveness. Judas doesn't. In his remorse, he commits suicide. And just FYI, I know this is going to shock you. Nowhere in the Bible does it condemn suicide. Did you know that? As a Catholic Church, we do. We say that is a serious sin to commit suicide. But there's no biblical injunction against suicide. And so, but by the Catholic tradition, Judas sinned by committing suicide. Does that make sense? But here's the but, and I love this. So there is this veteran law of hospitality. The law of hospitality is a very high law. And the law is this. If you eat at my table and I feed you, under the law of hospitality, no matter how egregious your crime is against me, because I offered you food for 3 days, I cannot pursue prosecuting you. Does that make sense? Or revenge? Mm-hmm. So think about this. Jesus makes a big deal of handing food, directly making sure Judas eats it. And according to the law of the veteran law of hospitality, then Judas has 3 days. Does that make sense? And what happens in 3 days? The resurrection. So maybe Judas is saved. The Catholic position is not, we don't say anybody's in hell. We don't know. Our proclamations of who we believe the saints are in heaven. So nowhere do we officially think Judas is in hell. Does that make sense? I'm not saying he's not in hell. I'm just saying we don't take a position. And according to the law of hospitality, maybe Christ did raise up Judas, could even save Judas, is my point. And I like that because it sounds awful. No, this really does sound awful. Like, I try and say Mass daily, right? But I never want to go 3 days without having communion, because just in case I mess up, I got that. If I die, I can say, well, wait a minute, 3 days, I'm covered. I know it's screwy, but I'm a mental case. But maybe Judas is covered under that. And so you get these odd myths about Judas, especially in the Middle Ages, that like Dante, where Dante puts him in hell being tortured, all this other stuff. I'm not saying I'm against Dante, but how do you know that I just making Judas look so bad as the betrayer distance the fact that I could be a Judas. Does that make sense? In the ways that all of us are Judas. And then in the Middle Ages, you have all these sexual sins associated with Judas, where even there's this Appalachian song that blames Judas's sister because she's the one who caused Judas's downfall because some sexual thing. It's always the woman's fault, and it's always about sex. So my only point, yeah, it's true. Let's see. Okay, so now, because we're running out of time, I have to do one more apostle, and that, well, can we take a 5-minute break? Okay, well, let's not. Let's take a 2-minute break.
So they're not
So they decided leaving. So nice. You are a cool guy.
So is she still in school? So we're still
Okay. Should we start back up? Did that answer your question about Judas betraying? Did that answer your question about Judas betraying?
He went right to the point.
Oh.
Because I felt that, maybe his act was actually a redeeming act, maybe because suicide is a category, but I think instead of despair, it may have been penance that he did that.
No, his sin would have been despair.
Yes.
But maybe Jesus can even work with despair. Yeah.
Thank you. It doesn't answer.
Okay, the last, or not the last, but the next apostle that we're going to cover today, really quick, is Jude. Now, technically, his name would have been Judas, but we don't want to confuse him with the other one, so we call him Jude. Does that make sense? So he's also called Jude Thaddeus. Thaddeus seems to be a nickname because it actually means courageous heart. He is called by Luke Jude of James, quote unquote. That's actually pretty ambiguous. We really don't know what it means, but he seems to have seems to have some sort of relationship to James the Lesser. And it doesn't say what it is. I mean, clearly he's not the son of James, but there is some sort of familial tie between Jude and James the Lesser. Now, there is an early church legend about Joseph having some other sons. I told you about this last week, right?
Yes.
There's also evidence that Mary and Joseph are connected to an Essene community, and virgins would marry an older widowed man so that they could keep the vow of virginity. James the Lesser is connected with Joseph, and Jude seems to be related to James. And the legend, the tradition is that Jude's mother and the Virgin Mary were cousins. So when it says of James, somehow James and Jude could be second cousins. Is that second cousins? When my mother's cousins' children? The Bascos, have you ever known Bascos do that? Where they'll say, oh, she's my cousin. And then you find out, well, technically she's your second cousin. But they don't really denote things like that. That's their cousins. So anyhow, there's some sort of familiar connection between Jude and James. Let's see. We're not quite sure. All the disciples goes out. Seems that Jude preached in Persia and Egypt. Jude and Bartholomew are believed to have been the first Christians in Armenia. I actually do believe that because it's so long-standing. That's why they're the patron saints of the Armenian church, which, just by the way, going off on another tangent, you have to stay loose and agile when listening to me. The Pope got into big trouble with Turkey because he mentioned the Armenian genocide, which was a genocide, but the Turks don't like to admit it. So they're all ticked off. But I love the fact that he's the first Pope who could mention the genocide of the Armenians. Even John Paul II wouldn't mention that. He died in Beirut, which is the Roman province of Syria. His body was brought from Beirut to Rome, and he's in the crypt of St. Peter on the left transept of St. Peter's Basilica. and his bones are next to Simon the Zealot bones. Therefore, the Feast of Jude is with Simon, not because they died together, but because their bones are placed next to each other. Does that make sense? And just that, it does strike me as amazing that you can go to the St. Peter's Basilica, and you're standing in the area that Peter's bones are buried, and 2 other apostles' bones are buried there, and Paul somewhere. But does that, like, that just strikes me as just such a heavy stone. He seems to be the author, or at least the source, of the letter of Jude, and he's also the patron saint of hopeless causes. Why? Well, to be honest, and this sounds goofy, but it's so goofy it's also very Catholic. Because the other apostles were patron saints of other things, and it seemed that Jude had a lot of time on his hands because he wasn't named the patron saint of anything, so they thought, well, he has more time on his hands, so they made him the patron saint of hopeless causes. So crazy, it's very human. But even St. Bridget of Sweden and St. Bernard in this vision was, in the vision God tells them, consider Jude the saint of impossible causes, which therefore pushed forward. Also in the letter of St. James, it stresses that you should be faithful even during persecution. So that's kind of connected with hopeless causes. And then, and to me this is kind of interesting, the devotion for St. Jude in the United States kind of got escalated because around Chicago, there's this heavy influence of the Claretian and the Dominican priests in the 1920s, all that had devotion to St. Jude, and kind of imported it into the United States via Chicago. That's why today, guess who is the patron saint of the Chicago Police Department? Isn't that bizarre? But it's really because of the Dominican priests who were there. What's that? Yes, especially what's going on these days, it does seem to be a hopeless cause. So really, sorry, we don't have much on Jude. That's why I put him in today, because I knew we would be running over. So any questions on Jude? Right, any questions on Andrew?
Acts of the Apostles?
Yes, St. Luke wrote Acts of the Apostles.
You mentioned women, crucifixions and everything. Were they ever crucified?
I don't know.
Because I mean, you said how bravely they stood before the crucifix, but if there's
Yeah, now that you said that, I don't ever remember anything on that. So I don't know. But it is odd. Saint Therese of Lisieux. I love the story where she is going through this monastery, and she is such a brat. She's so obnoxious. She's going through this monastery, and she just wants to see the artwork, right? But at one place where there's artwork, typical, it's always anti-woman, there's a sign that said, "No women allowed." And she reads this, and she says, well, that's ridiculous. It was the women who are the most faithful in the gospel. They're the ones who stood by the crucifixion. And I love this part where she says, and you go to church on any Sunday, there's always more women than men. So she kind of like, that's ridiculous. And she just walks right in. Doesn't that just crack you up? So this monk walks up to her and points to the exit. She points to the artwork, and he goes. That has nothing to do with Jude. But I don't know about women being crucified.
So all the apostles left Jesus when he was during the Passion, right? And it was only
Well, it does say the beloved disciples stayed
okay the
with
whole
Mary.
time, or did he suddenly appear at the cross when he was crucified?
Don't know. All it says that he stayed. But is that John the Apostle, or is that supposed to be us?
Oh,
I don't know.
for that.
Don't worry, she knows.
Okay, so periodically in this class even we say, is that in the Bible? And you say no, but it's historically founded. Is there one trusted historical source to start with if we were interested
No.
in? No.
The problem is, how you view history today is not how they viewed history at that time period. So, like, I forget what it starts with an H, the patron saint of historians who started the Greek, what's his name? Anyhow, it's over here. There's the father of history students, this Greek guy. He comes with dialogues. He writes dialogues that clearly nobody could have known. But that's not lying. It would be in, like, United States, we'd consider that lying. They'd be considering, no, I'm telling you what the story was about. I'm making it a dialogue. But, so, like, you have the stories like Josephus, who mentions, what Jesus looked like. But their view of history is different than our view of history. So they didn't, the idea of being literally true, that's a modern invention. They'd say just get the point.
Father, you mentioned the anger, and we all have anger towards the.
My mother doesn't.
Towards the sinners and that being a way of life that they've battled forever, I guess. Where do you draw the line between what am I trying to say? Between shooting them down and being peaceful?
Oh.
Because they're gonna kill people, so.
Yeah, I don't know. There is kind of a blurry line there. But that's what a conscience is for. So I asked Dorothy Day, would you ever kill somebody? She said, absolutely not. I would not. So then the reporter asked, and I hate this, says, well, what if somebody was endangering the life of your daughter? And she says, then I would do whatever I had to save my daughter. But I'm not aiming to kill somebody. I will do whatever it takes to save my daughter. But there is a fine distinction. If somebody's threatening your daughter, you may end up having to kill somebody, but you're not murdering them. You're saving their daughter. They do die. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so not
Yeah,
everybody.
so she said, I'd do whatever I had to save my daughter's life. But it's not like I'm killing on.
Or that's your first impulse is to kill, to save.
Your impulse is to save. So yeah, I do believe we should have a military. But I have this priest friend who was in Africa. No, he wasn't in Africa. He was an African priest. Got my liturgy degree with him. And he said, my village was about to be attacked by these other people that we knew were in the, several reports came, they're definitely in the jungle, they're headed this way, what do? We struck first. War is inevitable. They will kill women and children. Our men went first to save, but that's not quite the same thing to me. Oh, yes.
Didn't Pope Francis even talk about a just war?
I don't know. I hate the just war theory because the problem is in my head I've often talked myself into things that later I kind of think, no, you've talked yourself into that. And what I don't like about the just war theory is you can always talk yourself into it, but I think it was noble of those who entered World War II. You can't let those horrific, I think the heart is better at detecting those things than the head, to be honest, in my opinion. I could be wrong. As I said, I know nothing. All right, so glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without